Hello everybody and welcome to the naval map of Norway. This map has 3 different variations, and as I go through this video I will be showing off each variation of the map, though 2 of them aren't that different overall compared to the other one's layout, but later in the video they will actually be up on screen so you can compare them. As for the variations themselves, the first one is the domination variants, the first of which is the 2.0 to 4.7 battle rating variant that is mostly destroyers and very early cruisers, with of course the ubiquitous coastal fleet and aircraft sprinkled in. The later variant of this one is the 5.0 plus BR domination, which allows battleships into the fray along with the late cruisers and widens the map up quite a bit. The characteristics of each of these are fairly similar. The 4.7 map is smaller and more focused on the cap zone areas, and the capture points between the 2 maps are the exact same. They don't move when the map gets bigger. They also both share similar spawn points for the destroyers and the boats, with 2 boat spawns per team near B and C caps. The destroyers, which can spawn closer than the cruisers and battleships behind the A cap point. The cruisers, which on the 4.7 limited variation spawn further back and a little bit west of the A cap from a single spawn. And then when this bumps up to 5.0, it adds in the 2 battleship spawns per team. One of these is further behind A and one way to the west, and the cruisers get shifted to share these spawn points. The plane spawns on these are in line with the battleship spawns, so they're pretty far back, but they're located so that they have easier access to the caps, being that they're both in line with the Bravo cap. The A cap on these maps is fairly open with very little cover and tends to receive pretty heavily concentrated fire from either side of the map, so it's definitely a long range cap which may get taken early on by a boat, but normally it'll be a late game capture point. The B and C caps, however, are closer together, and they're in this very cluttered area with lots of little islands that are fairly tall that prevent a lot of long-range fire from getting in there and helping out all the smaller ships. This forces players that go to these caps to be pushed into very brawling close-range fights that are especially dangerous with the boat spawns being basically right on top of the capture points, and the fact that every destroyer is loaded down with torpedoes and ready to just come around an island and drop them in your side. Moving on from the domination mode, we have the encounter mode. This is limited to 4.3 plus battle ratings, so you won't see it as a low tier ship for the most part, and it is the same map size as the 5.0 plus domination mode. So same exact map, just gets rid of the cap zones. It has 1 battleship and cruiser spawn per team in the very far west position that you saw on the domination map. 1 destroyer spawn that is further eastward and very close to each team's fleet. Each team also has 2 boat spawns, 1 between the blue water spawns and slightly closer to the enemy, and 1 outside of where the cap zones normally are over in the east. The air spawns, however, are the exact same, and both fleets that the enemy teams each have to attack are located in the east, where the domination would have the 2nd battleship or cruiser spawn point. But now we can get into the map itself. As per my other video, I will be giving this map a review before going into every change that I would make for it, and then tips in general for your gameplay on this map. Before I do get into the review side of this though, I do want to say that I'm running a poll on my community tab to see what you guys would like me to cover next as per guides and that sort of thing. So please do go vote, and if this does help you, hit the like button so that I know to do more of these in the future. Now, as per the review of this map can be very enjoyable depending on your ship, and honestly on the map overall I wouldn't change very much. As far as this map being biased for either side, I would say in the encounter game mode the northern side definitely has the advantage, but in the domination game mode the southern team has the advantage, though the map overall is fairly symmetrical. Neither team really gets much of an advantage, so it's not a very overbearing bias like Northport has. Overall, and the reason why this map might be enjoyable if you have a certain ship and if you don't, is because this map tends to be very close range. 10 to 11 kilometers will be the max you fire at for probably 90% of the time, and the teams tend to spawn within 10 kilometers of each other, even at the higher battle ratings. So in most aspects, this is a close range brawling match, where if your ship is fairly light and an easy target, you may just disappear in the first few seconds of the match, and it might not be a super enjoyable experience for you. As far as the ships that will have fun on this map, if you can take a hit, if you have good alpha strike potential with your guns, or high rates of fire where you can just tear enemy ships apart, you'll probably tend to enjoy this. The ships like the 5.3 US heavy cruisers do tend to suffer because, like I said before, they're fairly light and they don't have guns that can just obliterate the enemy that are attacking them. And heavily torpedo based ships like the Japanese destroyers also don't favor too well on this map, just because of the amount of islands that exist on it. Those will block a lot of your torpedo lines and prevent you from getting your torpedoes off and into the main enemy fleet. As far as the caps are concerned, they're all fairly close together and can be dominated by boats and destroyers if the teams don't push into the islands and risk a close range torpedo rush in order to push out these smaller boats from being able to just sit there and control the caps for the entire game. Overall, I do enjoy the dichotomy of the wide open water near the spawns, with the middle kind of being clustered with islands that you can dip in and out of, and then the caps being completely cluttered with islands and being very threatening for larger ships to push into. The other thing to note about this map is the water is fairly shallow over the entire map, so if you have a very large vessel that gets destroyed, it probably won't sink all the way, which means it'll become kind of a pseudo island when it sinks. And that can be particularly aggravating when you're pushing out of your spawn and you end up hitting a ship that you can just barely see sticking out of the water, and it will completely stop your ship and act like you're beached, like you just hit an island. So it's definitely a interesting difference in this one compared to other maps. Another thing that is fairly enjoyable with this is the higher battle rating maps, so the larger maps, have multiple routes that you can take from the spawns depending on if you want to sail straight in and just brawl the enemy fleet, or kite at longer ranges. And overall, despite these multiple avenues of attack, you tend to see players take the same routes over and over, usually taking that kind of kiting route, whereas a few other ships will just push in and brawl. A good example of this being the Pittsburgh replay in my recent overview of the entire American ship line. And going off to counter that, some players will opt to not sail anywhere. This map does have a few camping spots despite it being fairly symmetrical, and the north side actually gets 2 camping spots compared to the other team's 1. So north side, it gets 1 behind the peninsula at the westernmost spawn, which can dominate the southern team's spawn point and is extremely prevalent in the encounter mode. You'll typically see 1 to 2 ships behind here just absolutely pummeling the enemy fleet until of course they receive some return fire. The other spot for the north side is mainly for the 5.0 plus domination mode, where players will camp around the island to the north of the A cap and just decimate any ships that push for it. On the flip side, the southern ships in the 5.0 domination mode tend to camp around a similar island to the south of the caps, and while they can still fire on the A cap, they have a much better ability to support ships pushing into B and C, and also later push into B and C themselves due to the open water between this island and the caps themselves. One thing to absolutely dislike about this map though is in both of the larger modes, the southern team's ships in the westernmost spawn can't maneuver much to avoid fire due to the outcropping of islands along the map's southern edge. It really restricts the lighter ships in your fleet from kiting the enemy team and maneuvering to avoid fire, whereas the northern team, the landmass above their spawn kind of slopes away and gives them a lot more room to maneuver and dodge fire. So it's definitely a bias towards the northern side on this one. And while that is a negative for the southern team, the southern team does however get much better access to the B and C cap zones in both domination modes, being able to sail basically straight in while the northern team is funneled into one path by the large landmass above the caps. So it basically makes the northern team kind of a shooting gallery as they actually try to push in for these caps. It is much harder for the northern team to take this, which kind of balances it out a little bit. Though, it does have another bias for the northern team in encounter, because the northern team's heavy ships can fire on the enemy cargo fleet a lot easier and a lot sooner due to the layout of the islands in the center of the map, and they're basically able to do this right after spawning, and that's also where the southern team will be getting most of their damage taken, because like I said before, they can't maneuver very much. So it just kind of adds to the bias for the northern team in the encounter game mode due to the prevalence of that one camping spot, being able to shoot the enemy cargo fleet a lot sooner, and the southern team just not being able to maneuver to avoid fire. And if all that wasn't enough just to hamper the enemy team's southern spawn in that western section there, they also spawn bow-in, which is fairly painful because they're forced to make a turn before they can actually fire on the northern team's spawn, whereas the northern team's spawn point has them spawn broadside. So not only can the southern team not maneuver, they have to turn to get their guns on target, and while they're turning, the enemy, or the northern team I should say, is already pummeling their ships with all their batteries. So it just keeps stacking and stacking on them when it comes to the encounter game mode, giving that northern team a very heavy bias in that one. And with that, I'll wrap up my review of this map and move into things I would change. Like I said, it is a fairly symmetrical map and there's not a lot that I would actually change with it, but I do have a short list of things that I would like to see tweaked slightly. The first of which being that southern map edge. Just remove the islands there, let the southern team maneuver instead of being forced into basically a killing zone and being completely broadside while they do it, with no way to maneuver and just avoid enemy fire. Let them have that little bit of breathing room rather than being boxed in. The next thing I would say that would kind of help with this is raise the height of the northern team's peninsula that's right in front of their spawn so that people can't fire over it, or on the flip side, lower it so that it isn't as good of cover and leaves the northern team's ships fairly visible for the southern team to shoot. This would go very well to just balance out that point in particular and make it so that if ships do try to sit back there and camp, they're a lot easier targets. On the flip side, like I said, if it's raised, it just negates that point entirely because, well, they can't use it as a camping spot in the first place. But of course, the northern team does need a little bit of help too. And with that, I would say give them better access to the cap zones in the domination game modes by removing some of the landmass that's above the caps. It doesn't have to exactly match the southern team's very wide access to them, but it should be enough to prevent the ships on the northern team from being funneled into basically killing zones in order to contest these zones. Even just shaving off the very tip that sticks out to the west would be a major help for the northern team, and make it so that if the southern team gets access and domination of these caps in the domination game mode, the northern team can actually contest it without just, having to sacrifice their entire fleet to at least attempt to try to get to these caps. And sticking with domination mode changes, shift the A cap further west. Make it more of a cruiser, battleship, destroyer capture point, rather than being easily contested by a coastal boat that just shoots over from Bravo with a very short trip compared to a lot of other maps. This might require reconfiguring some of the middle islands to make it more even on the approach for either team, but I would think it's a lot better than having all these caps clustered right next to each other and basically saying, well, you didn't spawn a coastal this match, so you didn't get any of the capture points. Moving back to the encounter mode for this change, and it's a fairly simple one, reconfigure the center islands just to prevent the northern team from getting those early shots on the enemy cargo fleet. This is important because sinking a cargo ship is a pretty massive amount of point loss for the enemy team, So these early shots into the enemy fleet, especially if they can sit there and do it for a little bit because the southern team is just getting obliterated in their spawn, means that it's already a northern team victory at that point. So I would just add an extra island or two to keep the southern team's AI cargo fleet out of view of the northern team spawn, just to prevent those early shots and save the southern team those extra points. And last, and probably easiest of all my changes, would be to just change the southern team's western spawn point to spawn all the players' ships broadside rather than bow on. At least let them get their guns on before they're completely decimated by the northern team, rather than having to make that abysmally hard turn right as they spawn in, which is pretty detrimental to a lot of stock ships that end up getting the spawn point. And it would save a lot of collisions in the spawn point because, well, everybody's trying to make a turn, and everybody has different turn rates, and we all know how that ends up with the War Thunder spawns. Alright, let's move on to the tips for this map. So, first and foremost, if you're spawning a destroyer in the domination game modes, just drop torpedoes to the A-cap and focus your attention on Bravo and Charlie. It is much easier to control these 2 points together because they are much closer together, and your destroyer won't be picked off by any cruisers or other things sailing around in the open water. Just drop your torpedoes through that little gap, hope that they hit something that's charging for A, and get in there and brawl to your heart's content. Obviously, it's a little bit harder if you have a slow firing destroyer like a Japanese destroyer, so you might have to adjust it based on what ship you're playing, but for most destroyers I would say this is the way to go. Continuing with domination for the tips, if you get the southern side with a heavy ship that's not a destroyer or a coastal, use the eastern spawn point and support Bravo and Charlie instead of taking the western spawn point and trying to push for A. You'll be a lot safer from anybody camping the peninsula in the north, and you can control these two cap points, meaning Bravo and Charlie, a lot better, and this is very easy for you to do in that southern side compared to what the northern fleet has to do to get in there and try to contest you. Branching off of that, if you are spawning a blue water ship and you consider pushing directly for A, I would not. I'd wait till later in the game when the enemy fleet is already beat down to attempt to push for this cap, because early on it just makes you a very easy target. You're out in front of your fleet, you're sailing directly towards both of the enemy team spawns, and you're just going to get torn apart. So wait till later in the game for the heavier ships on each team to be beaten up or sunk or that kind of thing, and then make your push towards the A cap if you still need it. As far as the other two caps go, if you're in a large blue water ship, you should wait for support to push into these two caps, as boats and many destroyers will run circles around you and decimate your ships with torpedoes at close range, all while using the islands as cover. Wait till you have a couple destroyers with you, or a cruiser, or something that can at least contest these other boats, so that you're not just in there alone in your battleship. Something comes around a corner and wipes you off the face of the earth before you can really get any effect down to even try to control one of these cap points. Teammates are fairly helpful in these situations. This next tip applies to all the game modes, though mainly for the larger maps, and that is to avoid using the islands out in the middle of the map as cover. Even if you beach yourself, for the most part they're not tall enough to stop most rounds, and with how small the islands are, there's a lot of angles where the enemy team's ships can still get fire into yours, and you'll find yourself sinking on a fairly short notice, because chances are you're also the closest one to the enemy team, and they're going to single you out for that. So I would say don't count on these as being cover overall, just use them as kind of barriers for torpedoes. And speaking of things that you can shoot over, if the enemy is camping one of the three aforementioned spots on the map, you can shoot back in most cases if you try. These landmasses aren't high enough to block you from targeting the enemy ship, so if you maneuver your camera a little bit, most of the time you will be able to select them as a target and line up your shot. And when you target them, there's a pretty good chance the island won't catch your shells, And these camping ships are fairly easy targets as most of them will be sitting still, so if you put your gun in the exact right spot, you have a pretty good chance of getting a magazine detonation on them without any retaliation because, well, they're sitting still and camping. They're probably distracted shooting at your team, and they did not expect an enemy ship to get a lock on them. So it makes pretty easy targets if you know how to shoot over these islands. And the last tip that I have an example for, if you're on the southern side and encounter, you can actually use the peninsula in the north as cover for yourself. And you can kind of push up the western side of the map, but this is only suggested for ships that can brawl, as you will be getting a lot closer to the enemy fleet than a lot of your team, and you're only really covered from the ships that are camping behind the peninsula. Most of the enemy team will be sailing straight out from back there, and you make a pretty juicy target if you're in a light ship just kind of sailing around in that open water over there right in front of their guns. So if you can take a hit, highly suggest using it to your advantage just to avoid whatever is behind the peninsula and shooting into your team, but be aware you're probably going to take some return fire from the enemy team in general. Now my last couple tips I don't really have any drawings for, but it doesn't make them any less important. In the encounter game modes, deal with the players nearby first, but don't neglect sinking the enemy cargo fleet. Sinking those ships causes a large point loss for the enemy team, and even one sunk cargo ship can make the difference between a win and a loss, because they're almost, or maybe they are, 1,000 points off the enemy team's tickets per sunk cargo ship. And the cargo ships themselves are fairly easy targets, and they're fairly fragile, so anything can sink them. So highly suggest it. If you have a shot on a cargo ship and you're not threatened by the enemy team, take one out. It might push the winds of victory into your team's favor. On the flip side of that, don't forget to support your own cargo fleet with your ship as needed. Your cargo fleet does need anti-aircraft cover, and it is pretty crucial sometimes, as many planes will just sit up high and decimate your fleet offhand just because you sunk their ship earlier in the match, and it'll push it over the edge to where it's basically irrecoverable for you to win. The other thing is that coastals can sneak up on your cargo fleet while using the eastern islands for cover and decimate it from relatively covered positions, so they can pop out, launch a couple torpedoes at your fleet, and duck back into cover without really getting hit. So actually getting near your fleet and helping them out with a little bit of your firepower is highly suggested in order to keep the enemy team from whittling your points away that way. And my last tip could be a little bit weird based on everything else I've said in this video, but if your ship is fairly fragile, consider waiting an extra few seconds to spawn in. It'll save you from being targeted before you can create distance to maneuver with while the enemy team's busy with your team's bots or other players that can actually take a hit. And if you're also in one of these lighter ships, you could consider using the camping spots to your advantage. Though, while you're camping, still consider moving towards the objectives if needed, because a lot of times your ship could make the difference. You shouldn't just sit there in that camping spot just because you can get shots on the enemy team, because you could be the ship that causes a loss because you weren't over there killing the enemy team's destroyers or protecting your fleet. So while you can use them, don't just sit there the entire game. But that's really all I have for tips on this map. I do think it's a fairly good naval map, though it is punishing for the lighter ships, and it is biased for either side just due to the camping spots and access to the cap zones. But overall, I really do like it. Hope you guys enjoyed. I hope some of this helped. Like I said, leave a like if you did enjoy this so that I know to make more in the future. And good luck out there. I'll see you next time.